I think there's a lot more to know about dart cutting for beef that we don't necessarily understand. We've given a lot of focus to that immediate pre-slaughter stress for pigs. I think a little bit the nature of how cattle are, pigs are loud. They tell us kind of when they're stressed or upset. Cattle, I don't think do it quite the same.
Hello, meat folks. Welcome back to the MeatsPad podcast. It's your humble host, Phil Bass, here with a former colleague of mine from graduate school way back when. Well, not for you, but way back when from Colorado State, Dr. Lily Edwards-Callaway, who is currently at Colorado State University.
Yes. Thank you for having me, and thank you for calling me old.
Not you, just me. So when we were in graduate school, I was going down the meat science path, but we got to interact a little bit because of your research that you were doing at the time, and currently, you work in animal welfare and animal behavior. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Well, so for the audience listening, we kind of dance around the topic oftentimes with our listeners, and we have had some folks in the past, but maybe you can just define animal welfare, animal handling. What is this whole topic that we need to be more aware of?
So I'll start, and you'll probably have to cut me off because there's so many different things to say about what animal welfare is or isn't. And I think everybody really wants a definition of animal welfare. And I think there's probably not one definition, but I think generally when people talk about it, it's talking about, the quality of life of an animal, the mental and physical well-being of the animal, and all the different things that kind of influence that. I think when we talk about good welfare, the things that you probably hear about are nutrition, health, no pain, no fear and distress, being able to perform behaviors that are important to that animal. So it's multifaceted, it's complex. If you kind of promote one part, you might trade off and the other component isn't as great. And so I think sometimes it's a struggle because it's definitely value driven. There's science to it, but sometimes you got to make some choices as well.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your background too, because it's not just that, and we'll get into your background a little bit more, but it's not just I like what you said. It's not just one thing or the other, and we have to find that happy balance because we have to continue to move forward in society, for that matter. But finding that balance between what's right for the animal, which is always very important. We have to keep that in mind because it's the right thing to do, and oftentimes it's the law too, which that coincides nicely in that particular case. But it also leads to benefits from a meat quality standpoint. I mean, this is MeatsPad. We talk about meat, and so let's think just a little bit of what is it that we can benefit from better animal behavior understanding, and especially at the packing house phase.
Yeah, so I think the easiest kind of example to think about when we think about welfare and kind of quality or end product value is bruising, because to me that's like a direct impact on the animal is going to have a direct impact on something on that carcass. I think the tricky thing with bruising is that we don't see it until it's over, and so kind of getting in the mindset that, oh, hey, that handling facility isn't great because every time those animals move through there, they just slam into that gate. I think we need to connect the dots backwards a little bit more than we probably do. But I mean, a bruise that can be from a human interacting with an animal, it can be from a facility interacting with an animal, and it can be from animals interacting with each other, right? And I think you said behavior. I think sometimes we forget that a lot of times it's how they interact with each other, especially if they've never been mixed together. And so thinking about kind of that end process of going to the terminal slaughter plant, a lot of those things that we kind of ask the animal to do are just additional risks to potentially impact bruising.
Don't mix groups of livestock, people. My goodness, especially that last couple days, or the last couple of hours even, because they're going to have to reestablish hierarchy.
Yeah.
That's just their nature, right?
Yeah, and I think it depends on kind of if you think about probably animals from a feedlot the commingling isn't as much of a concern because it just doesn't happen as much. But if we think about those market cows and bulls, they potentially get mixed many, many different times. And so I kind of think about it as it's not necessarily, that the mixing is causing the bruising, or that the fact that they are going to a sale barn or two is causing the bruising. It's just it's adding more potential opportunities for risk to the system. So the more kind of touch points the animal has, of course, there's more chance that there might be a bruise on the end product.
Yeah. Well, and beyond bruises, we know that stress can lead to meat quality defects.
Yeah, and I think so on the cattle side, dart cutting would be the great example of that. I think there's a lot more to know about dart cutting for beef that we don't necessarily understand. We've given a lot of focus to that immediate pre-slaughter stress for pigs. I think a little bit the nature of how cattle are, pigs are loud. They tell us kind of when they're stressed or upset. Cattle, I don't think do it quite the same unless those kind of several individuals might, right? And so I think there's a lot more to learn about that pre-slaughter marketing process and how that might impact quality on cattle.
Well, that's interesting. And this wasn't in my initial notes, but let's go down that road because thankfully, Lily was there during my time at Colorado State while I was doing my graduate work and helped me a lot with glycolytic potential.
Oh gosh!
Right? You were the one that you set up the lab for me. You set up the lab for me. Whether you can do it still now or not, that's up to maybe some of our graduate students. But tell us a little bit about what might be going on physiologically there, from stress standpoint.
Yeah. So I think if we think about animals, I guess it's a little bit kind of the gas they have left in the tank. So to speak.
I love it. I love that analogy. Yep.
So when they get to the plant, what have they experienced that has kind of asked them to expend more energy? And when we think about stress, like sometimes it's physical exertion, sometimes it's mental stress through those things that we kind of talked about, the stressors. As low stress as we try to make the system, there's just some inherent stress to it. And so I think, you think about that quality impact. And so with cattle, it's oftentimes, they say more chronic, but I think when we think chronic, several days, weeks before they go to the slaughter plant, what have they experienced that's might going to deplete that glycogen? So when they get to the plant, they're kind of at a different point to start postmortem metabolism after they're stunned.
And glycogen is simplest terms muscle sugar that's remaining there, carbohydrate.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of times we think about, higher percents of dart cutters are seasonal. So those really big fluctuations in weather and temperature. So around, August, September, things like that, we see higher levels. And so oftentimes it isn't that immediate time at the slaughter plant, but I don't know, I think it takes a little while to replete glycogen and replenish that into the system, as it takes a little while, I should say, to replenish the glycogen that's been repleted. And so I think, sure, probably things that happen at the plant maybe don't have as much of an influence. But if we think about, looking backwards, how long are those animals in lairage? How long were they waiting on the truck? How long were they shipped? How long were they waiting?
What were the weather conditions while they were shipped?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Where did they come from? How long were they waiting to after they were weighed at the feedlot to get onto the truck? And so I think there's probably some opportunity in that space to understand that a little bit better.
Absolutely. Well, and that could be a whole nother discussion on another day. Dart cutting was a chapter of my dissertation, and so again, thankfully, Lily was there to coach me through the laboratory process in that particular case. So let's talk a little bit about how can we monitor animal handling and animal welfare, and I guess more so from a plant specific perspective, but maybe even up the chain.
Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to monitor it. I think sometimes people, they hear animal welfare and they're like, oh, how do we do it? How do we monitor it? But I'm an animal welfare scientist, so there's a science behind doing that. I think, most simplistically at the plant level, to your point before, there's regulations around animal welfare and animal handling. So I think it's potentially a little bit more straightforward. But we look at things that the animal does and also that the human does. And so, just some examples, and these have been around for a very long time. Dr. Temple Grandin, who we both know, really helped was, foundational in creating these audit tools that we use. And so we look at things like animal vocalization. And so it's not just, the cows chatting to the other cows in the pens. It's that kind of bellow vocalizing in response to a handling event or bumping into a facility, a sharp edge or something like that. So we look at vocalization, electric prod use, falling. So if, a human is pushing an animal or moving an animal too fast, it might fall. If the flooring's not good, it might fall. And then there's quite a few metrics around stunning and insensibility and making sure that process is done correctly. And then there's other things, like water access. So at a plant, that's required. So that's audited. Trust but verify.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And then there's a whole bunch of secondary items. I think in the animal welfare space, we try to look at the animal-based outcomes. Those are things about the animal. Sometimes that's hard, and there's a lot of resource-based things, so things about the environment that might change the risk to the animal that are sometimes easier to capture, and so there's sometimes a lot of those that we might look at, like training records, for example.
Yeah. Well, and document, trust but verify.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that little bit of the catchphrase that you mentioned there. And there are a number of auditing organizations out there, right?
So PACO, the Professional Animal Auditor Certification Organization.
How about that?
I practiced that 5 times this morning. No, I'm just kidding. So they can certify audits, and they also provide training for auditors.
Okay.
And so generally, they're people at the plant, people that audit packing plants have gone through one of their trainings. But then there's, to your point, third-party auditing companies that perform those audits. But oftentimes those individuals are PACO certified.
Right. So, and this is just a really good point for our listeners out there for these all size plants, that this is yet another spot that we can measure. And if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And so this is a measure that we can take.
Yeah. And I think the thing is sometimes people get overwhelmed by, so the large plants, have a lot of people that help perform those audits, and they perform a lot of them. A smaller plant, I don't think the expectation is ever to do it all the time, every shift, every day, but maybe weekly would be a great way to kind of integrate that into your system. And so I think there's some, there's the same audit criteria, but kind of simpler ways to approach how you integrate doing the audits into a system that's just smaller.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I'm sure we can get folks in touch. If you go to info@meatspad.com, we can connect you with auditors if that's a question. We connect you with all kinds of other experts in the area. Speaking of experts, Lily, what does the future hold for animal welfare, animal handling research? Have we figured it all out?
No, we have not figured it all out yet, Phil. No. Why don't you come back? You can do a postdoc with me. How about that?
Okay. Since I'm not doing anything.
We'll do glycolytic potential all day long.
Yeah.
No. So I guess there's a huge future, right? It's growing. It's really growing. There's a couple papers that I like to use in presentations because it shows just that trajectory of just publications in the space, right? And that's not really the only metric we can look at. I think the interest from undergrads, especially ones in the meat science space, I've found that, it's sometimes hard for me to find students because it's like, yes, let's go to slaughter plants and measure animal welfare. And so it sounds almost like an oxymoron, which it's not. But I do think meat scientists appreciate that kind of combination because they understand the meat process and the production of food. So I think, and if you think about the animal welfare space, there's so many different topics within animal welfare, and it's quite, specialized. So different universities, for example, Iowa State, there's a lot more pigs there than there are at Colorado State. So they do wonderful research across species, but, I don't do a lot of pig research. So CSU, we do a lot of work with cattle. Quite a bit of work with dairy as well. Another area that I think is really growing is that interface between humans and animals. And so I think, although we all know and appreciate the importance and I think the impact that a human can have on an animal, we haven't necessarily always looked at the vice versa, animal on human, especially in agriculture. And so,
wow.
Oh yeah,
it was sitting there the whole time.
I just rocked the MeatsPad. Yeah. No, so we've been doing a lot more work in that space, which I think is exciting.
That's very exciting. So, okay, so you just mentioned a number of things, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your background, but I'll mention Dr. Grandin now, and I've heard her say a number of times, she used to try to fix everything with equipment. And that's only half the challenge. It's you have to have the human interaction. You have to have well-trained people who understand animals, and maybe it's the other direction as well, which is kind of a cool topic, which I'd love to come back and learn more about that from you. But tell us a little bit about your background, because I would say it was a slightly different path you took.
Yeah.
Right? To get to where you are right now.
Just say it's weird. It's weird, Phil.
Aren't we all just a little,
We're
though?
all a little weird. That's why we're friends. Yeah, it is a little different. So I'm from Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who is from Rhode Island?
Only like 10 people. No. And I probably know them all. No. I grew up in the Northeast, so like zero ag, interaction for when I was little. I went to college, small liberal arts, thinking I was going to be a doctor, and I took those physics classes, and I was like, oh, I guess the only thing you can do with science, which I don't like because I don't like physics, is be a doctor, and I can't do it anymore, which is silly, right? So I kind of finished up my degree, foreign language major, did some different things, and then I was like, as corny as it sounds, I like animals, I like science, like what could I do in that space? Didn't really want to be a veterinarian. And so I got a master's in animal science, but it was in Rhode Island. So animals, there are a lot of fish there. So it was in kind of a fisheries and pre-vet department, worked with zoo animals.
Primates, right?
Yeah. Yep. And applicable to the work I did was applicable to livestock. It just happened to be, working in zoos. And my advisor had been like, have you ever heard of Dr. Temple Grandin? And I actually, at that time, I had not. So I read one of her books and I was like, wow, like she's amazing. So I remember calling her from a landline. Everyone knows what
You're
those
dating
are.
yourself now.
You already did it. You started out the
podcast.
I called her, to see if she had any spots. And I remember calling her on a weekend, and I was like, oh, she's not going to answer. But Temple totally answered.
Oh, yeah.
And I interviewed at Colorado State. She took me to a sale barn, which I had never been to before. I sat on my hands because I didn't want to buy anything by mistake, inadvertently raised my hand. And I guess a little bit, the rest is history. So I came to Colorado State, and got my PhD there, pre-slaughter stress in pigs. So I'd never been to a packing plant in my life. And so the first time I was like, I guess what, 26 years old. And I actually loved it. I love going to the packing plant.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then you spent some time in industry as well, right?
Yeah,
Not
I did.
just academics.
Yeah. So I was on faculty at Kansas State for a little bit, and then I had the opportunity to come back to Colorado and work for JBS and oversaw their welfare programs. And I learned a ton. So I spent a lot of time in slaughter plants. You are correct.
What an enormous change. Wow. How cool is that? So, well, I really appreciate this. I know that we can go off on a number of different topics, and let's keep those for the future, but let's stay in touch. I'm really interested about this human interaction thing, and it sounds like that's still kind of a new area. So maybe we'll come back to that one at some time.
Yeah, that would be great because there's a lot more coming in that space.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lily. It was great to see you.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah.